The small town of Maplewood, nestled in the heart of the United States, had always prided itself on its quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the kind of safety that allowed children to play freely without fear. Life moved slowly here, with church bells marking Sunday mornings, the local diner serving steaming coffee every sunrise, and townsfolk greeting one another by name. But beneath its calm surface, Maplewood now found itself at the center of a storm that threatened not only its sense of peace, but also its faith in justice. The courthouse, an old brick building that had stood for over a century, suddenly became the most watched place in town. Every morning, crowds gathered on the courthouse steps. Some came out of curiosity, others to show support for the victim's family, and still others simply because they couldn't believe such a high-profile case had landed in their small community. Reporters from nearby cities arrived in vans, setting up cameras and microphones outside, eager to capture every development. For a town that had never made headlines, Maplewood was now front-page news. At the center of the case stood a man named Richard Holloway. He was no stranger to trouble, but the accusations this time went far beyond his past misdeeds. He was charged with a crime so disturbing that the very mention of it in the courtroom left the air heavy with discomfort. People whispered in the pews of the courthouse about his long history of intimidation, his violent temper, and the way he had always seemed untouchable. Yet this time was different. This time, there was a witness who could bring the truth to light. But that witness wasn't a seasoned adult or an expert investigator. It wasn't someone hardened by years of experience. It was a child barely 3 years old. Her name was Emily Carter. Emily had been present the night the crime occurred. She had seen what no one else had seen. The tragedy that unfolded in front of her tiny eyes had left a mark that words could not easily describe. But the prosecution's case rested heavily on her testimony. Without her, the evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. With her, they had a chance to secure justice and put Holloway away for good. The challenge, however, was as monumental as it was heartbreaking. Emily had not spoken a single word since that night. Her silence was not just a stubborn refusal, nor was it a child's game of avoiding questions. It was the silence of trauma, the kind that builds invisible walls around the mind, shutting out both memory and speech as a form of protection. Psychologists who examined her explained that such silence was not uncommon in young children who experienced or witnessed extreme fear. But knowing the cause did little to ease the prosecution's worry. How could they build a case when the most important witness might never speak? Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense from the very beginning. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Blake, paced her office late into the night before every hearing. She was known for her relentless pursuit of justice, but this case tested even her strength. She understood the weight of relying on a toddler to take the stand. She had prepared every strategy she could, consulted with child specialists, and even rehearsed how to ask the simplest of questions without frightening Emily further. Yet nothing could erase the nagging doubt that haunted her. What if Emily never spoke? On the other side sat the defense attorney, Charles Denning, a man as smooth as he was sharp. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen plenty of cases fall apart on technicalities. To him, a child's silence wasn't an obstacle, it was an opportunity. In his mind, no words meant no evidence. And without evidence, his client could walk free. Judge Robert Matthews presided over the trial, a man nearing retirement with decades of courtroom experience. He had seen countless cases, some heartbreaking, some hopeful, but never one quite like this. From the bench, he watched the little girl, seated beside her parents, her eyes wide and unblinking, clutching a small stuffed toy in her hand. She never looked at the defendant. She never looked at the lawyers. She simply stared down at her lap, lost in her silence. The judge knew the weight of what was unfolding before him. He also knew that the world beyond those walls was watching, waiting to see whether justice could prevail under such fragile circumstances. Every morning when Emily entered the courtroom, the room shifted. The jurors softened their expressions. Reporters leaned forward, and even the sternest court officers lowered their gazes, recognizing the gravity of asking a 3-year-old to carry such responsibility. Her presence was a reminder of both innocence and tragedy, of how the smallest among us sometimes bear the heaviest burdens. Her parents sat close, their faces pale with worry. They had tried for months to coax her voice back. At home, they played her favorite songs, read bedtime stories, and encouraged her with gentle words. But Emily only responded with silence. Therapists brought toys, art supplies, even puppets, hoping she might express herself in another way. Sometimes she would draw shapes and colors that didn't always make sense, but never once did she speak. Despite the heavy silence, the prosecution pressed forward, hoping that the very act of being in court might awaken something in the child. They believed that deep down, Emily wanted to speak, that her silence was not defiance, but fear. And if they could find a way to help her feel safe, maybe, just maybe she would. The town held its breath with each passing day of testimony. Witnesses came and went. Experts gave their analyses. The jury listened carefully. But everyone knew the case would ultimately rest on the moment Emily took the stand. It was a gamble of enormous stakes. Would a toddler be able to tip the scales of justice? Or would her silence become the very thing that set a dangerous man free? As the trial entered its second week, the weight of the case grew heavier. Rumors swirled in town that the prosecution might crumble, that Hale's smirk in the courtroom was a sign of his inevitable freedom. But then, an unexpected suggestion emerged, one that would change the entire course of the trial. It came from a courtroom advocate who had seen children like Emily before. What if we try bringing in a therapy dog? The advocate suggested. At first, the idea sounded unusual, almost too simple. But given Emily's silence and the desperation to reach her, it was worth a try. What no one realized was that this single decision would alter not just the outcome of the trial, but the lives of everyone inside that courtroom. Emily Carter was only 3 years old, but the weight she carried in her silence was heavier than most adults could ever imagine. Her world, once filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and playful afternoons in the park, had collapsed on that single night when her innocence was shattered. Since then, not a single word had escaped her lips. At home, her parents tried everything they could. Her mother, Laura, would sit beside her with picture books, pointing at the drawings and asking gentle questions. "Emily, what's this? Is it a cat? Can you say cat?" But Emily would only blink, her large eyes focused on the page as if she could see it, but not allow herself to name it. Her father, Daniel, tried to coax her with her favorite stuffed animals, animating them with silly voices. Sometimes she would smile faintly, but still, her lips never parted. Doctors explained it in clinical terms: selective mutism, post-traumatic stress, psychological shock. But for her parents, those explanations didn't ease the ache of watching their little girl trapped in silence. They longed for the sound of her voice, even if it was just a whisper. Her laughter, once so frequent, now felt like a memory slipping away. By the time the trial began, Emily had been silent for nearly 5 months. That silence was not only a personal burden, but also a legal crisis. The prosecution needed her to speak, to name what she saw, to give the jury something no piece of evidence could offer: the human truth of innocence witnessing evil. But how do you ask a child who had locked away her words to suddenly open them up in front of strangers, in front of the very man who had caused her silence? The first day she entered the courtroom, the room seemed to shrink. Though the ceilings were high and the wooden walls echoed with authority, All eyes went to the little girl in the tiny dress, her small shoes tapping nervously against the floor. Her parents flanked her on either side, guiding her to the witness box, where she sat holding her stuffed rabbit, ears worn thin from being squeezed in anxious little hands. The judge, Robert Matthews, leaned forward with unusual gentleness. He was a man known for his stern demeanor, but when he looked at Emily, his features softened. "Good morning, Emily," he said in a slow, careful voice, as though speaking to his own granddaughter. She didn't respond. Not a nod, not a blink of recognition. She only clutched her rabbit tighter and stared at the edge of the desk before her. The prosecutor, Sarah Blake, tried next. She approached with a smile that masked her worry. "Hi, Emily. My name is Sarah. Do you see this picture?" She held up a drawing of a simple house with a tree. "Can you tell me what this is?" Silence. Sarah's heart sank. She had been warned this might happen, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The defense attorney smirked, leaning back in his chair, whispering something to Richard Hall. Hawley, the accused, allowed himself a small grin, his eyes never leaving the child. Sarah noticed Emily flinch at the sight of him, her small shoulders curling inward as though trying to make herself disappear. The defense attorney rose and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, this is exactly why we cannot rely on the testimony of a child this young. She cannot respond, and even if she could, how do we know her words would not be the product of suggestion? This is a waste of the court's time." The words stung. They were cruelly logical, but Sarah refused to back down. "She is our witness," Sarah said firmly. "Her silence does not mean she cannot speak. It means we must find the right way to help her." The judge sighed, tapping his gavel lightly. "We will proceed, but Ms. Blake, I advise you to consider other means. This child is under enormous strain." The next few days followed the same painful pattern. Sarah tried flashcards, soft questions, even toys, hoping Emily might loosen her tongue. But Emily stayed frozen, her silence unbreakable. The jury shifted in their seats, growing restless. The media outside reported the case as slipping away from the prosecution. Headlines in local papers read, "Key witness silent, trial in jeopardy." Behind closed doors, Sarah felt the pressure closing in. She met with Emily's parents often, strategizing late into the night. Lavra wept quietly at their kitchen table, confessing her fears that maybe Emily would never speak again. Daniel tried to remain strong, but his jaw tightened, and his knuckles turned white whenever Hale's name was mentioned. For Emily, the silence was not a choice. Inside her tiny mind, the memories played over and over like a film she could not stop. The sound of shouting, the slam of a door, the terrifying shadow of a man's figure looming in the dark. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, those memories pushed back, suffocating the words before they could escape. Silence became her shield, her only way to keep the world out. Her therapists suggested patience. They told the prosecution that forcing her could re-traumatize her further. But the courtroom did not run on patience. It ran on deadlines, motions, and verdicts. And each day without Emily's voice felt like a victory for Hale's defense. The jury, though sympathetic, could not decide a case on silence alone. Hale's attorney emphasized that point at every opportunity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said during cross-examinations, "you cannot convict a man because of what a child might say. Until she speaks, there is no testimony, only speculation." Each time he said it, Sarah's stomach tightened. She looked at Emily, praying for even the smallest sign of words, but none came. It was during one of these tense afternoons that an unusual suggestion was made. A child advocate who had been observing the case approached Sarah during recess. She was a woman with years of experience working with traumatized children in the foster system. "Have you considered using a comfort animal?" she asked. Sarah frowned. "A comfort animal?" In court? Yes, the advocate replied firmly. There's a program in some states. Dogs trained to sit with children during testimony. Sometimes it helps them feel safe enough to speak. Sarah hesitated. It sounded unconventional, and she worried how the judge might react. But when she looked at Emily, her tiny fingers trembling as she gripped her stuffed rabbit, she realized the suggestion might be the only chance left. That night, Sarah sat in her office, long after everyone had gone home, reviewing notes, reading case studies, and searching for precedents. There weren't many, but there were a few Story's children who had spoken their truths only when comforted by the steady presence of a dog. It was risky, but worth a try. She made the motion the next morning, surprising both the defense and the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but determined. "The prosecution requests permission to introduce a trained police dog, certified in courtroom comfort work, to accompany the child witness during her testimony." The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. This is a criminal trial, not a petting zoo." But Judge Matthews held up his hand. He looked at Emily, then back at Sarah, then finally at the defense. "Given the circumstances," he said slowly, "I am inclined to allow it. If it helps the child find her voice, this court will not stand in the way." For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in the courtroom. Emily remained silent that day, but something had shifted. The promise of a new approach was on the horizon. And with that decision, the door opened for the entrance of an unlikely hero one, whose soft fur and gentle eyes would succeed where all others had failed. The courthouse had grown used to tension. Every day was the same. The shuffle of jurors into their seats, the rustle of reporters' notepads, the quiet hum of whispers that died down the moment the judge entered. But on this particular morning, there was something different in the air. People glanced curiously at the door as the bailiff stepped in with a leash in his hand. And at the other end of that leash trotted a golden retriever, his fur shimmering in the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. His name was Max. Max wasn't just any police dog. He had been specially trained as a comfort and support animal, part of a small but growing program designed to help vulnerable witnesses, especially children, feel safe in court. While many police dogs were trained for tracking or apprehension, Max's gift was gentleness. He could sense fear, respond to anxiety, and offer a calm, steady presence to anyone who needed him. As Max padded softly across the courtroom floor, his nails clicking lightly against the wood, the atmosphere shifted. The stiff formality of the trial melted, just slightly, under the warmth of his presence. Reporters exchanged surprised looks, jurors leaned forward in curiosity, and even Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow with interest. But it was Emily's reaction that mattered most. The little girl sat at the witness box, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly against her chest. Her wide eyes, usually fixed downward, lifted when Max entered. At first, she looked startled, almost as if she couldn't believe a dog had been allowed in such a serious place. Then, slowly, her expression softened. Her lips parted ever so slightly, not to speak, but in something close to wonder. Her mother, Lavra, whispered beside her, "It's okay, sweetheart. His name is Max." Max approached carefully, led by the bailiff, and sat just a few feet from Emily. His tail wagged once, then twice, before he settled, resting his chin on the edge of her chair as if offering his companionship. Emily blinked down at him, her small hands trembling as she reached out. When her fingers brushed his soft fur, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For the first time since the trial began, Emily smiled. It was fleeting, just a tiny curve of her lips, but it was enough to send ripples of astonishment through the room. The prosecutor, Sarah Blake, felt a surge of hope. She had spent days battling Emily's silence, nights lying awake, wondering if the case was slipping from her hands. But now, Watching the girl stroke Max's golden coat, Sarah thought, this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. The defense attorney, Charles Denning, was less impressed. He leaned toward his client, muttering something under his breath. Holloway scowled, his confidence dimming slightly, as he realized the jury was captivated, not by evidence or arguments, but by the silent bond forming between a child and a dog. Judge Matthews cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, the court recognizes the unusual nature of this accommodation. However, if this animal's presence aids the witness, we will allow it. His voice carried both authority and compassion, setting the tone for what was to come. From that moment forward, Max became Emily's silent guardian. Whenever she entered the courtroom, Max was already there, waiting patiently by her chair. Emily no longer clung as tightly to her mother's arm. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the dog, her fingers brushing his fur for comfort. He responded with small gestures, pressing closer, resting his paw near her feet, or looking up at her with warm, reassuring eyes. The change was subtle, but undeniable. Where Emily once sat curled into herself, shoulders hunched and gaze fixed downward, she now seemed a little taller, a little braver. Sarah took note of these changes carefully. She didn't push Emily with questions right away. Instead, she let the bond between child and dog grow naturally. For days, Emily remained silent to everyone else, but her connection with Max deepened. During breaks, she would crouch beside him, stroking his ears, sometimes even leaning close to whisper words no one else could hear. The first time it happened, Lavra gasped softly, covering her mouth with trembling hands. She had been waiting months to hear any sound from her daughter's lips, and while she couldn't make out what Emily said, the sight alone brought tears to her eyes. Did she just? Daniel asked, his voice breaking. Lavra nodded, too overcome to speak. Word of Emily's whispers spread quickly through the courtroom. Though none of the jurors could hear her, they could see her lips moving, see her small hands gesturing as though confiding in a trusted friend. And while the defense tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, the jury couldn't ignore the fact that Emily was slowly breaking through her silence, just not for the adults, but for the dog. It was as if Max had unlocked a door no human could open. Sarah began to adjust her strategy. Rather than asking Emily direct questions, she encouraged her simply to tell Max. When Emily froze under the gaze of strangers, Sarah would gently say, "It's okay, Emily. You can tell Max instead." At first, Emily only leaned closer to the dog, her voice too soft to be heard. But the more she repeated the behavior, the more confident she became. Each time, the jury leaned forward, straining to catch the faint sound of words. And though they couldn't hear, they could see the way Max's ears perked, his head tilting attentively as if he understood. The defense grew increasingly frustrated. "This is absurd," Denning protested one afternoon. "We can't allow the jury to interpret a child whispering to a dog as testimony. It's inadmissible, speculative, and frankly ridiculous." But Judge Matthews, who had been watching the transformation carefully, disagreed. "While the dog cannot testify," he said firmly, "the child's progress in his presence is undeniable. We will proceed with patience." The defense had little choice but to accept it, though Hale's expression darkened with every passing day. His once smug demeanor now seemed restless, uneasy. For the first time, he realized that silence might not protect him much longer. Outside the courthouse, the story of Emily and Max spread like wildfire. Reporters began running features on the golden retriever who had stolen the spotlight. Photographs of Max, sitting patiently beside Emily, appeared in newspapers across the state, capturing hearts everywhere. Headlines read, "Comfort Dog becomes key ally in high-stakes trial," and "Silent Child finds voice through four-legged friend." But inside the courtroom, away from cameras and flashing lights, the transformation was even more profound. Emily's eyes no longer darted in fear when Halle entered. She no longer buried her face in her rabbit. Instead, she rested her hand on Max's head, as though drawing strength from him. The bond was unexplainable to some, but undeniable to all who witnessed it. Max had become more than a companion. He was Emily's bridge between silence and speech, fear and courage, truth and justice. And though the trial was far from over, Sarah Blake knew one thing for certain. This dog had changed everything. The question was not if Emily would speak, but when. And when that moment came, everyone in the courtroom understood. It would alter the course of the trial forever. The days that followed Max's arrival brought subtle but unmistakable changes. The courtroom, once suffocating in its tension, seemed lighter now. Every time Emily entered, clutching her stuffed rabbit with one hand and reaching for Max with the other, the jury leaned forward, their guarded expressions softening. Even the judge, who prided himself on maintaining strict neutrality, couldn't deny the ripple of warmth that spread through the chamber whenever the golden retriever padded in, tail swishing gently like a banner of reassurance. For Emily, the world had always been split into two since that night, before and after. Before, her world had been filled with bedtime lullabies, scribbles of crayon rainbows, and the safety of her father's arms. After, it was shadows, silence, and nightmares she could not shake. But with Max by her side, the terrifying courtroom, the place that smelled of polished wood and echoed with voices too loud for her ears, didn't feel quite so frightening anymore. On one particularly tense morning, the prosecutor, Sarah Blake, decided to try something different. She had been observing Emily closely, watching how the child bent her head toward Max, whispering secrets too soft for anyone else to hear. Sarah had already adjusted her approach once, shifting from direct questioning to gentle encouragement, but now she felt ready to take a bolder step. As Emily sat stroking Max's ears, Sarah crouched down so that she was at the child's eye level. She spoke softly, her tone carefully measured, not the sharp, practiced cadence she used for cross-examinations. "Emily," she said gently, "I know it's hard to talk to me, but it's okay. You don't have to talk to me or anyone else if you don't want to. You can tell Max instead." Emily's small shoulders tensed. For a moment, Sarah feared she had pushed too far. But then Emily tilted her head, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as she leaned down toward Max's fur. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Max's ears twitched. His tail wagged once, slowly, as though in response. Sarah didn't catch the words. No one did. But the sight of Emily, whispering to Max, sent a collective murmur through the gallery. Parents dabbed their eyes. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Judge Matthews leaned forward on his bench, his usually stern face softening into something like wonder. Lavra, sitting beside her daughter, felt tears sting her eyes. She hadn't heard her little girl's voice in months, though the words weren't meant for her. Just the sight of Emily's lips moving again broke open something inside her chest. She reached for Daniel's hand, squeezing it tightly. He, too, looked overcome, his jaw clenched as he blinked rapidly, fighting emotion in front of the packed courtroom. The defense attorney, Charles Denning, immediately rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked. "This is utterly inappropriate. Whatever the child whispered to that animal is not evidence. This court cannot take seriously the ramblings of a toddler to a dog." But his voice lacked its usual bite. The objection sounded desperate, hollow in the face of what everyone had just witnessed. Judge Matthews rapped his gavel once, silencing the room. "Mr. Denning, you are correct that a dog cannot testify," he said firmly. "But what we are seeing here is progress. This child is beginning to find her voice again, and the court will allow time for that to continue. Proceed, Miss Blake." Sarah nodded, her pulse racing. She turned back to Emily, but instead of pressing with more questions, she simply offered reassurance. "That's very good, Emily. Max is listening. He's always listening." From that day on, the courtroom developed a new rhythm. Sarah's questions were no longer aimed directly at Emily, but at Max. "Max, can you ask Emily what color her dress is?" Sarah would say with a small smile. At first, Emily only tilted her head toward the dog, whispering so faintly that no one could hear. But gradually, over the course of several days, the whispers grew more audible. The first word anyone besides Max heard was simple blue. She had whispered it when Sarah asked about her dress. It was barely more than a breath, but the sound carried across the silent courtroom like a church bell on a still night. Lavra broke down in tears right then, unable to contain the flood of emotion. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, his own eyes wet as he watched his daughter speak her first word in nearly half a year. The jurors, moved beyond measure, sat straighter, their skepticism dissolving into empathy. Denning tried again to object. "Your Honor, this is manipulation. The prosecutor is leading the child with irrelevant questions just to get her to speak. It's a tactic, nothing more." But Judge Matthews shook his head. "Mr. Denning, if the child finds safety in answering through the presence of the dog, then so be it. We are not here to debate methods of comfort. We are here for truth. Continue." With each session, Emily grew braver. She never looked directly at Halle, never pointed a finger or raised her voice, but her confidence bloomed in the shadow of Max's presence. She answered softly about her toys, her favorite food, her favorite color. Each word was another brick pulled from the wall of silence she had built around herself. And then came the moment that shifted everything. It was late afternoon, the sunlight streaming in golden rays across the benches. Sarah, feeling the time was right, asked carefully, "Emily, do you remember the night you felt scared?" "You don't have to tell me. But maybe you can tell Max?" The courtroom held its collective breath. Emily froze, her eyes darting toward Halle for the briefest instant. His cold stare made her shiver, but Max nudged his head closer to her lap, grounding her. She clutched his fur, pressing her face into his ear. Her lips moved again, but this time the whisper carried far enough for the nearest court officer to hear. He leaned down, straining, and then repeated aloud what Emily had said. "Bad man." The words reverberated through the chamber like thunder. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Lavra collapsed into tears, Daniel holding her as sobs racked her body. Sarah froze for a moment, stunned, and recovered, her heart pounding with adrenaline. The jurors stared wide-eyed at the child, their expressions shifting as if they had just witnessed a miracle. Denning jumped to his feet, shouting over the noise. "Objection! This is completely inadmissible. She's parroting, Your Honor. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Hale's reaction betrayed him. His face drained of color, his confident smirk wiped clean, replaced by something raw fear. His hands clenched on the table, knuckles white, as though he could crush the verdict with sheer force of will. Judge Matthews raised his gavel, banging it hard against the wood until silence fell. His eyes, usually steady and detached, lingered on Emily with a rare softness before he spoke. "The objection is noted," he said, "but the child has spoken. Let it be recorded." The court adjourned moments later, but the story had already taken flight. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, news outlets across the country were running headlines. 3-year-old breaks silence in court. 2 words that changed everything. Inside her parents' car that evening, Emily sat cradled between her mother and father. Max's leash still looped loosely in her small hand. She didn't speak again that night, but she didn't need to. The 2 words she had whispered had shifted the tides of the trial. She had broken her silence. And with it, She had opened the door to justice. The courtroom had never felt so heavy with anticipation. Since the day Emily had whispered her first words, "Bad man," the trial had taken on a new intensity. The jurors, once unsure if a 3-year-old could possibly influence the case, now watched her every move with rapt attention. The public gallery filled each day with more faces, eager to witness the child whose quiet voice had shaken the foundations of silence. But with the breakthrough came a greater burden. Everyone knew the defense would fight back with every tool at their disposal. Charles Denning, Hale's lawyer, had already filed motion after motion, arguing that Emily's statements were unreliable, that her age made her testimony invalid, that the presence of a dog in the courtroom was a form of undue influence. Judge Matthews rejected each motion with measured words, but the battle lines were clear. If Emily spoke again, truly and undeniably, the case could be decided then and there. For Emily, the world of grown-ups and their arguments meant nothing. She only knew that the room was big, the people loud, and the man across the room made her stomach twist with fear. But she also knew that Max, her golden retriever friend, sat beside her each day, his steady warmth like a shield against the shadows. On the morning of her next appearance, Emily clutched her stuffed rabbit with one hand and Max's leash with the other. Lavra walked at her side, trying to appear strong, though her heart pounded harder with each step toward the courthouse doors. Daniel followed close behind, his jaw tight, as if his very presence could keep his daughter safe from all harm. Inside, reporters crowded the hallway, cameras flashing as whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's her. The girl who spoke." The words followed Emily like an invisible cloud, though she paid them no mind. She only looked down at Max, who wagged his tail, unbothered by the chaos. When they entered the courtroom, Sarah Blake rose immediately, her expression resolute. She had prepared carefully for this day. Every question she planned to ask had been chosen with precision, crafted not to overwhelm, but to guide Emily toward the truth. The prosecution's entire case now rested on a fragile bridge of trust between a child and her dog. Judge Matthews adjusted his glasses, scanning the room before speaking. "Court is now in session. We will resume testimony." His eyes softened slightly as they landed on Emily. "Miss Blake, you may proceed." Sarah approached the witness stand slowly, crouching down once more so she wasn't towering over Emily. She kept her tone calm, almost motherly. "Emily," she said gently, "do you remember when you told Max 2 words the other day?" Emily nodded, her small fingers twisting Max's fur. "That was very brave," Sarah continued. "Today, we don't need you to say many things. Just a few, if you feel ready. You don't have to look at me or anyone else. You can just tell Max, like before." Emily hesitated, her wide eyes flickering toward Holly. He sat stone-faced at the defense table, his gaze locked on her. The moment her eyes met his, she recoiled, pressing her face into Max's ear. The sight made the jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. The silent reaction spoke louder than words. Sarah quickly redirected. "Emily, Max is listening. Do you remember who the bad man was?" The room went still. Emily's lips moved, her voice so faint it almost dissolved into air. But then, louder than before, she whispered into Max's fur. "Him." She lifted one trembling finger and pointed across the room straight at Hal. The gallery erupted. Gasps, cries, murmurs spread like wildfire until Judge Matthews slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" Denning shot to his feet. "Objection. This is prejudicial. The child is being led, she—" "Overruled," Matthews snapped, his voice sharper than usual. "The child has identified the defendant of her own volition. The jury will take note." Emily, though visibly shaking, stayed close to Max, burying her face in his coat again. Lavra covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Daniel reached an arm around her, though his own face betrayed the storm of emotions he fought to contain. Sarah didn't push further immediately. She gave Emily a pause, allowing the child to settle. Then softly she asked, "Emily, can you tell Max what the bad man did that made you so scared?" The words hung like a blade over the room. Emily's fingers dug into Max's fur. For a long moment, it seemed she might retreat into silence again. But Max nudged her gently with his nose, and that simple gesture gave her courage. She whispered again, this time clear enough for the courtroom microphones to pick up. "He hurt Mommy." The words pierced through every heart in the chamber. Lavra gasped, collapsing forward into Daniel's arms. Sarah's throat tightened, but she forced herself to remain steady. She had expected something, but hearing it from Emily's lips was like hearing the truth carved into stone. The jury's faces hardened, a collective wall of sympathy for the child and quiet condemnation for the accused. Denning attempted another objection, his voice rising in desperation. "The child is confused. She's been coached. This is hearsay." But again, his protest rang hollow. The jurors weren't looking at him. They were looking at Emily, trembling yet determined, her small voice cutting through months of silence. Judge Matthews leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Let the record show. The witness has identified the defendant and provided testimony regarding the incident. Ms. Blake, proceed with care." Sarah nodded. She knew she had enough, but she also knew how fragile Emily was. She asked no further probing questions that day. Instead, she smiled at the child. "You did so well, Emily. Max is very proud of you." "And so am I." Emily leaned down, pressing her cheek against Max's head, as though drawing strength from the praise. For the first time, a tiny smile flickered across her lips. As court adjourned, the room buzzed with emotion. The prosecution had their breakthrough. Hall sat stiffly at the defense table, his face pale, his eyes dark with fury. Denning whispered furiously to him, but it was clear. Their control over the narrative had shattered. Outside, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but the police formed a protective shield around the family. Lavra carried Emily in her arms, whispering soothing words. Daniel walked beside them, his hand never leaving his daughter's back. That night, news broadcasts replayed the clip again and again. A 3-year-old, voice trembling but clear, pointing her finger across the courtroom and saying him. Analysts declared it a turning point. Commentators debated the legal weight of her testimony, but none could deny the raw power of the moment. And though Emily was too young to understand the tidal wave she had unleashed, one truth was certain. She had broken her silence, not just with whispers to a dog, but with words that carried the weight of justice. For the first time in months, she had spoken for her mother, for herself, and for the truth. And the trial would never be the same again. The moment Emily pointed her trembling finger and whispered, "Him," the courtroom ceased to feel like a place of law and order. It became a stage where silence thundered louder than words, where a child's small voice pierced through walls of doubt, denial, and polished legal rhetoric. The jurors leaned back in their seats, some with widened eyes, others with jaws set in grim determination. For weeks they had listened to arguments, examined evidence, and endured Denning's sharp rebuttals. But no piece of evidence had carried the same weight as the voice of innocence, the voice of a child who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking. Sarah Blake, standing near the witness stand, held her breath as though afraid the fragile moment might shatter if she moved too quickly. She had prosecuted countless cases, but never had she witnessed a courtroom so completely transformed by a single utterance. Even Judge Matthews, known for his stone-faced impartiality, looked shaken. Across the room, Hale's mask of confidence cracked. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against the polished wood of the defense table. His eyes darted to the jury, then to the judge, then back to Emily, as though desperately searching for an escape from a truth he could no longer control. Denning, however, was not ready to surrender. He shot to his feet, voice echoing against the walls. "Your Honor, I must reiterate, this testimony cannot be relied upon. The witness is a toddler barely capable of forming coherent memories, let alone delivering reliable identification. This is prejudicial to my client in the extreme." His words rang out, but the urgency in his tone betrayed him. He sounded less like a lawyer defending a client, and more like a man watching his defense unravel thread by thread. Judge Matthews raised his gavel, rapping it firmly. "Mr. Denning, your objection is noted and overruled. The witness has spoken under oath in this courtroom, before jury and judge. Her testimony stands. You may address reliability during cross-examination, but it will not be stricken from the record." The gallery erupted into hushed murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. The story had already been making headlines, but now it had transformed into something monumental, the testimony of a 3-year-old child, standing against a man accused of unspeakable crimes. Emily, unaware of the legal storm swirling around her, clung to Max. The dog's calm presence anchored her as Lara reached for her daughter's hand, her tears falling silently. Daniel, ever the quiet fortress, pressed a steadying palm against his wife's shoulder, though his eyes never left Holly, his expression a mix of rage and sorrow. Denning adjusted his tie, trying to regain composure. "Very well," he said tightly. "Then I request the opportunity for cross-examination." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The room stiffened. This was the defense's chance to dismantle what Emily had said, to convince the jury that her words were the product of coaching or fear, not truth. Every eye turned to Denning as he approached the child. He crouched slightly, attempting to soften his usually sharp demeanor. "Hello, Emily," he began, his voice forced into an unnatural gentleness. "Do you know who I am?" Emily turned her face into Max's fur, refusing to look at him. Denning continued, his smile strained. "That's okay. I just want to ask you a few questions. Can you tell me, did someone tell you to say those words today?" Emily said nothing. Max shifted, laying his head across her lap as if to block out the man's presence. Denning tried again. "Emily, you like Max, don't you? He's a good dog. But sometimes, when people whisper to dogs, it's just pretend, isn't it? Like a game?" Sarah Blake stood instantly. "Objection. Counsel is attempting to belittle the witness and undermine her ability to testify." "Overruled," Judge Matthews said after a pause. "The line of questioning may continue, but proceed with care, Mr. Denning." Denning pressed on, his tone sharper now. "Emily, can you tell Max again what you said? Or do you not remember anymore?" Emily shifted uneasily, her little hand fisting Max's fur. Her lips quivered, but no words came. The silence stretched painfully, every second amplifying the tension. Denning straightened, turning toward the jury. "You see? She doesn't even recall. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot place the fate of a man's life in the hands of a frightened toddler whispering to a dog." But the moment she spoke, Emily's small voice broke the silence. Barely audible, she whispered into Max's ear again. "Bad man?" The courtroom gasped. This time, a microphone caught it clearly. Her words echoed across the chamber, delicate yet devastating. Denning froze. The jury stared at him, their expressions unshaken. Sarah's lips parted slightly, her eyes glistening, but she kept her composure. Judge Matthews leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The record will reflect the witness has reaffirmed her testimony. Denning retreated, visibly shaken. He had hoped to expose weakness in the child's memory, but instead, he had solidified her testimony in the minds of the jury. When the session adjourned for the day, the courtroom buzzed like a hive. Reporters rushed to their stations, eager to file stories that would dominate headlines. Toddler holds firm in court. Calls defendant bad man twice. Analysts debated the unprecedented nature of the testimony, some calling it unreliable, others declaring it the most powerful evidence they had ever seen. Outside, Lavra carried Emily into the waiting car, her face streaked with tears. Daniel followed, shielding his family from the flash of cameras. Max climbed in last, resting his head on Emily's lap as if reminding her that she was safe. Inside the courthouse, Denning sat with Hao, his tone hushed but urgent. We need to reconsider strategy. The jury is slipping away. That child, she's too sympathetic. Hale slammed a fist against the table, his voice low and venomous. That kid ruins everything. Find a way to shut her down. But Denning's silence spoke volumes. The defense's foundation had cracked, and everyone in the room knew it. Meanwhile, Judge Matthews sat alone in his chambers, reflecting on what he had witnessed. In decades of service, he had seen countless testimonies, endless evidence, countless attempts at truth. But never had he seen justice hinge so profoundly on the quiet courage of a child and the loyalty of a dog. He scribbled a note into his record. This testimony may very well be unprecedented, but truth is not measured in age. It is measured in courage. That night, as the sun dipped behind the courthouse and the world replayed Emily's words on every news channel, one thing was certain. The trial had shifted irreversibly. The defense was wounded, the jury moved, and the entire nation was watching. And at the center of it all was a 3-year-old child who had broken her silence, leaving the courtroom stunned, the truth undeniable, and justice closer than ever. The courthouse felt different now. What had begun as just another high-profile trial had transformed into a national spectacle. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered in swarms, their microphones ready, cameras trained on every door. Headlines blared across the country. 3-year-old confronts defendant. Toddler's testimony leaves jury in tears. Police dog comforts child witness. Inside, the weight of Emily's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Her simple but piercing identification of Holly as the bad man had shaken every soul in the courtroom. Even those who prided themselves on impartiality found themselves replaying her trembling voice in their minds. But the trial was not yet over. Denning still had weapons in his arsenal, and Hale's fate rested on whether the jury believed Emily beyond a shadow of doubt. The defense would not go quietly, no matter how much the tide seemed to turn. That morning, Judge Matthews called the court to order, his gavel striking the bench with a solemn authority. We resume proceedings. Ms. Blake, Mr. Denning, be prepared to present your closing witnesses and arguments as this trial approaches conclusion. Denning rose immediately, his voice sharp. Your Honor, before we proceed, I must renew my motion to dismiss the child's testimony on grounds of unreliability. Matthews sighed heavily, his patience thinning. Mr. Denning, we've been over this. The court has ruled. The testimony stands. Then I request, Denning pressed on, that the jury be reminded explicitly that testimony from a child of this age must be weighed cautiously. As memory can be. Enough. Matthews cut him off, his tone steely. The jury understands their duty. Proceed with your case. Deflated but not broken, Denning adjusted his tie and nodded. Very well, Your Honor. He called a child psychologist to the stand, an expert who testified about the unreliability of memory in children under 5. Children this age, the expert explained, are highly suggestible. Their memories can be influenced by repeated questioning, parental input, even exposure to news stories. It is entirely possible Emily believes she saw or experienced something she did not. The defense latched onto this testimony like a lifeline, hammering the idea that Emily's words could not be trusted. But as the expert spoke, the jury's eyes often drifted toward the small figure sitting with her parents in the front row. Max curled faithfully at her feet. Emily wasn't playing or distracted. She simply rested her tiny hand on Max's back, quiet but watchful, her very presence a counterpoint to the defense's arguments. When Sarah Blake rose for cross-examination, her questions were calm but pointed. "Doctor, is it possible for children as young as 3 to recall traumatic events with accuracy?" "Yes," the expert admitted, though their recall is often incomplete. "And would you agree," Sarah pressed, "that children of this age are far less capable of inventing elaborate falsehoods than adults?" The expert hesitated, then nodded. "That is true." Sarah turned to the jury, her voice resonant. "So while Emily may not give us every detail, her words, 'bad man,' are not likely the product of invention. They are the simplest truth her young mind can communicate." The jury leaned forward, nodding almost imperceptibly. Sarah had struck at the heart of the defense's argument. After the expert stepped down, Denning attempted one last maneuver. He requested to call Halley himself to the stand. It was a risky move putting the accused in front of the jury, but Halley insisted. His pride and fury wouldn't allow silence. Halley took the stand, his tailored suit pristine, his demeanor carefully controlled. He spoke smoothly, insisting on his innocence, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance and lies. He painted Emily's testimony as the tragic confusion of a traumatized child. "I sympathize with the little girl," he said with mock sincerity, "but I am not the monster she believes I am." His words were polished, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with anger when Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, hiding her face against Max. Jurors noticed. So did Sarah. When Sarah rose for cross-examination, her gaze was unwavering. "Mr. Halley," she began, "you claim you are innocent. Yet you cannot explain why Emily, who has spoken barely a handful of words since the incident, identified you as the bad man. How do you account for that?" Halley smirked faintly. "Children are impressionable. Someone must have told her to say that. Someone like her parents?" Sarah pressed. "Perhaps," Halley said smoothly. Sarah's voice sharpened. "So you're suggesting a grieving mother and father coached their 3-year-old daughter to accuse you falsely? For what purpose?" Halley faltered. People do strange things in grief." The jurors frowned. His words felt cold, calculated. Sarah took a step closer. "Mr. Halley, Emily didn't just say words. She pointed. She looked at you and called you the bad man. That was not grief. That was not coaching. That was truth." Hale's composure cracked, his voice rising. "She's just a kid. Kids make things up." The outburst rang in the silent courtroom, his mask slipping before the very people who would decide his fate. Sarah let the silence linger, the sound of his anger echoing, before she quietly said, "No further questions." When Halley returned to his seat, Denning's face was pale. He knew his client's display of temper had sealed more than any testimony could. The next day, closing arguments began. Sarah stood before the jury, her voice clear, her words deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case has shown you evidence, witnesses, and testimony. But none of it carries the weight of a 3-year-old child who found her voice in this courtroom. Emily had no reason to lie. She gained nothing by speaking except fear. And yet she spoke. She called him the bad man. She told you the truth. Now it is your duty to honor her courage and deliver justice." Denning countered with everything he had left. "The stakes are high. Are you willing to convict a man based on the words of a toddler? Do not let sympathy cloud your judgment. Evidence must outweigh emotion." His voice was strong, but his arguments rang hollow against the memory of Emily's trembling finger and whispered words. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Hours passed. Reporters speculated outside. Families prayed inside. Emily napped against Max's side, unaware that the world held its breath on her behalf. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman rose, paper in hand, voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The words reverberated like a bell. Lavra collapsed into Daniel's arms, sobbing with relief. Sarah closed her eyes, exhaling a long, silent prayer of thanks. Hale's face twisted with rage, his fists slamming against the table as deputies moved in to restrain him. Denning slumped back, defeated, knowing the case had slipped beyond saving. Judge Matthews banged his gavel, his voice solemn. "Order in the court. The defendant is found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will follow." Then he looked at Emily, sitting small and quiet in her chair beside Max. His voice softened. "This court wishes to commend the bravery of the youngest witness ever to stand before it. Emily, you gave justice a voice today." The courtroom erupted in applause, breaking protocol, but no one stopped it. The moment was too powerful. A child had done what seasoned adults often could not. She had spoken the truth, and it had set justice in motion. That night, as the courthouse emptied and the nation celebrated the verdict, Emily lay asleep at home, Max curled protectively at her side. She had spoken only a handful of words, but those words had reshaped lives, toppled lies, and carved justice into history. The verdict had been delivered, the trial concluded, but Maplewood's courthouse remained a place etched forever in memory. The town, once defined by its quiet simplicity, had become the stage for a story that resonated far beyond its borders. Reporters wrote about it in national newspapers. Documentaries hinted at future adaptations. And child advocates across the country cited it as a turning point in how the justice system approached young witnesses. But for the people who had lived through it, especially for little Emily Carter, it was not just a headline. It was a chapter of life that would forever define them. In the weeks following the trial, the courthouse steps looked noticeably different. The crowds dispersed, reporters packed up their vans, and life slowly trickled back into its old rhythm. Yet something about Maplewood had changed. Strangers greeted each other with warmer smiles. Parents hugged their children a little tighter. And when Emily's name was spoken in hushed tones at the diner or the grocery store, it was no longer with pity, it was with admiration. Emily, once the silent little girl who carried the unbearable weight of fear, was now a symbol of courage. The image of her kneeling beside Justice the therapy dog, whispering those first words in court, had become iconic. It had not only swayed the jury, it had restored faith in the idea that even the smallest voice, when heard, could change the course of justice. For her parents, every day after the trial was a slow process of healing. They still carried the weight of trauma, but they also carried pride. Their daughter had not just survived. She had stood at the center of a storm, and in her own way, calmed it. Therapists continued to work with Emily, gently encouraging her newfound speech. Sometimes she would talk about simple things, her toys, her favorite colors, or the way Justice wagged his tail when she hugged him. Other times she remained quiet, as though retreating into her thoughts. But what mattered most was that the silence was no longer absolute. A barrier had cracked, and hope had poured through. The legal world, too, took note. Judge Matthews, in his written reflection after retirement, described the trial as the most profound of his career. He wrote not of legal precedent or courtroom drama, but of humanity, the kind that emerges when systems meant for adults are forced to bend in service of a child. "In all my years," he penned, "I have never witnessed a moment where truth arrived so gently, yet carried such undeniable weight." Justice, in more ways than one, was present in that courtroom. The prosecutor, Sarah Blake, became something of a reluctant hero in the aftermath. Though she shied away from interviews, preferring to let the story speak for itself, she used the case as a catalyst to campaign for broader use of therapy dogs and child advocates in courtrooms. No child should face fear alone, she argued in one conference. Her words struck a chord with lawmakers, and before long, new policies were introduced across the state to make courtrooms more accommodating to children. Defense attorney Charles Denning, though defeated, walked away from the case changed as well. In quieter moments, he admitted, even to himself, that for the first time in his career, he had seen the law bend towards something more powerful than strategy, truth spoken from the heart of a child. And while he never said so publicly, he felt a measure of respect for Emily that he could not ignore. But perhaps the greatest transformation belonged to Justice, the golden retriever who had been by Emily's side. Overnight, he became more than just a therapy dog. He became a symbol of compassion in its purest form. Donations poured into the therapy dog program that trained him, allowing dozens more dogs to be placed in courtrooms, hospitals, and schools across the country. People who had never believed in the power of animals to heal now pointed to Justice as proof. He had not testified. He had not argued. Yet, with his calm presence and gentle loyalty, he had helped deliver justice. Emily's life after the trial was not without challenges. Trauma lingers, and healing does not follow a straight line. But she also grew stronger with each passing day. In preschool, she began to make friends, though she remained quieter than most children. Teachers noticed her bond with animals and encouraged her parents to nurture it. She painted pictures of dogs and horses, spoke softly to the classroom fish, and, whenever possible, asked if she could see Justice again. Her parents arranged visits, and every time Emily saw the golden retriever, her face lit up with a joy that words couldn't fully capture. She no longer saw him as just the dog from court. He was her friend, her anchor in a world that had once felt so unsafe. Together, they represented something larger than themselves, the possibility of healing, even after darkness. The town of Maplewood moved forward, but it never forgot. Each year, on the anniversary of the trial's conclusion, townsfolk gathered not to dwell on the crime, but to celebrate the courage that had overcome it. They called it the Day of Courage, a community event filled with laughter, children's games, and therapy dog demonstrations. Emily's family attended quietly at first, but as years went by, Emily grew bold enough to stand in front of the crowd and smile, no longer the silent child she once was. By the time she turned 6, Emily was speaking freely, though her voice always carried a softness, as though she still remembered the silence that had once defined her. Her parents never pressured her to tell the story again. They didn't need to. The world already knew. And what mattered most was that Emily knew she had been heard. The case that shook the town had become more than just a trial. It became a story of resilience, a reminder that justice is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, carried on the small, trembling words of a child who chooses to break her silence. Years later, when Emily was old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened, her parents told her the story not as a tale of fear, but as one of courage. They described how her words had changed lives, how her whisper to justice had become a roar of truth in the courtroom. Emily listened quietly, her small hand resting on Justice's graying fur. When her mother finished, Emily looked at the dog, smiled, and said, "I wasn't alone." And that, perhaps, was the legacy that mattered most. In a world where the voices of the vulnerable are too often lost, one little girl proved that even the smallest voice can echo louder than anyone imagined. And with the help of a golden retriever named Justice, her whisper became the sound of hope.